but is this what the Europeans are waiting for then? When they talk about we have to prepare for a future war with Russia, is that a Russian retaliation they're talking about? Because if they really think that Russia's going to attack Europe, they would need at least to outline what the objective would be. What exactly would be the purpose of attacking Europe? I can only see one purpose. I mean, unless you believe in these fairy tales of restoring the Soviet Union, but the only purpose would be to restore its deterrent. But is then the goal to go to war?
Well, I don't know if you saw, Putin issued a response to the Germans the other day that was just scathing and sarcasm. Like the bottom line message was, why would we want to invade you and then have to be responsible for a group of transvestite, transgender, blue-haired weirdos? What do we gain from that? Sorry, we don't need that. We don't want that. You can have it. That was his basic message to him. And it was, it went on. It was like, I was recall like 8 or 9 points. I thought it was actually brilliant of him how he presented it, because it was entertaining, but it was also to the point. But Russia has to step back and look at these attacks that Ukraine are carrying out are not being carried out because Ukraine's got the expertise to do it. And the concern is you've had Ukrainian officials just of late talk about building a nuclear warhead. And there is a report out of a YouTuber by the name of Borzikman. Sometimes his reporting has been quite accurate, sometimes, questionable. But he claims that a recent arrival of a British ship in Odessa carried these yellow barrels that look to be as containing radioactive material. I'm sure Russia is now all over that, but you can't put it past the Brits of trying to do something that absolute crazy, that they would run that risk. This is, they are poking the bear. It's like they think that they can throw a punch at Russia and Russia's not going to react. And I maintain that is a dangerous, dangerous assumption. Russia's been slow to anger, but once their dander is up, they are most formidable.
Well, one can understand why. Well, especially the British, because they appear to be with the Germans among the most aggressive one in this war. But one can understand though, because they essentially designed a proxy war almost in the dream scenario during the Cold War. That is to have the Ukrainians and Russians kill each other en masse, and the West would stand on the sideline. And that's essentially what's been created here, though. Mm-hmm. It's a war where the Europeans have said, well, we have to bring this war to Russian territory, which they now have, but Europe is a safe zone. So all the industrial production, all the missiles and drones, which they advertise that they're producing to attack Russia with, all of this is within European or EU territories and British territory. So this can't be touched by the Russians. And essentially the Russians accepted this rule of the game. That is, the NATO countries can now launch long-range missiles and drones deep into Russia, and Russia is allowed to touch NATO territory. I mean, this isn't sustainable, especially now that it's becoming so much more open and larger scale. And also, as you said, the clear indication of intent, that is to fight a war once Russia has been weakened. But I was wondering, how do you see Putin's changed over time? Because last year he was all about diplomacy, anchorage, all of this. Now we don't hear much about diplomacy anymore. The main speeches, they're about war. That is, we will achieve our objectives. We have the military power. Yes, they have keep their arms open or door open for diplomacy, but they quite obviously do not believe that we will go anywhere.
Yeah. No, I think he's been, I don't want to say forced as if it's against his will, but he is cognizant of what the political pressures are, and whatever his personal desires for trying to avoid conflict, trying to avoid escalation, I think he's recognizes it's reached a point now where the demands of the Russian public are such that they want stronger action. Um, they want decisive strikes against Kiev, up to and including killing Zelensky, killing Shursky, killing the top leaderships. I mean, the reality is senior Russian officials and generals have been assassinated all along. And there's sort of this attitude, it's time for payback. But not just payback. You've got to cut the guts out of this thing and make it so that the Europeans also pay a cost. So that's why I say, when you listen to people like Medvedev, he's, I think his views are more in line with the majority of Russians than that of Putin. And so Putin in a way is playing a little bit of catch up. Now, I don't deny that the military strategy is not being set by Putin, it's being set by Gerasimov. But again, it's up to, the Russians have not asked me how to fight this war, and I'm not sure my advice would be all that salient. But I think we've now reached a stage where the Europeans are going to must pay a price for enabling this violence. Otherwise, they will continue to escalate it to a point that it will lead to a nuclear strike, and that's the danger. That in the efforts to avoid it, Russia's taking the very actions that will actually make it more possible.
Well, one can understand, though, the restraint of Putin, because if they now begin to hit back against the NATO country, as Mark Rutte, not to take him too seriously, but would argue, then the response would be absolutely fierce. But these people seem to think this is a computer game or of some sort, or at least that there's proper escalation control, that they can do this, and if the Russians retaliate, then they will be able to manage this. I don't think anyone's going to be able to control the escalation once the Russians finally retaliate. But
Yeah.
the whole idea is, the Russians do not dare until they do dare, as they did in 2022, and then it's completely unprovoked, and this is the time to stand up, against the new Hitler. It's, we know what the script will look like after the Russian retaliation, which is why it's quite dangerous. But what do you see being the thinking here on the European side, though? Because let's be honest, the Europeans, yes, they are declaring the intent, but they hardly have the capabilities. So, well, not yet. If the Russians wait much longer, then they might have more capabilities.
Yeah, you use the word there, thinking, implying that the Europeans are thinking, engaged in a rational thought process. I, for the life of me, don't know what they are thinking, because it's so illogical that, you step back and say, okay, whether I'm Germany or Poland or France or the United Kingdom, do I need to pay more for oil and natural gas, or do I need to pay less? Is it better for my country if I pay less? Well, in the world of logic, it's better if you pay less. But the choice, in particular with the Germans, is no, no, no. We're going to cut off all ties with Russia, who supplies cheap oil and gas. We will stand by and do nothing while the United States blows up the Nord Stream pipeline, compelling us as Europeans that we now must buy more expensive liquid natural gas from the United States. And in fact, we're going to ban any kind of economic interaction with Russia, which is going to weaken our economies, cause recessions, cause inflation, cause higher unemployment. And you're doing this consciously. They're doing this, they're choosing to do this. And then on top of it, say, oh yeah, and then we're going to take on Russia and we're going to fight it and defeat it. And you're going, let me see if I got this straight. You like the UK, you can't even fill a football stadium with your army. It's so small. Your once leading edge prowess in the world of maritime operations, that's gone. That's history. Germany with these factories that once churned out, some of the most leading edge military equipment are shuttered. And many of your factory jobs are now going overseas to the United States or other places. So here is Europe. They remind me of, think back to when you were in high school or whatever you called the education before you go to college. And there are the sports teams. And the guy who is the star soccer player, football player on that team, when they're 18, 17, 18, strong, virile, quite athletic. Well, now he's 60 years old. He weighs twice what he did back then, can barely run, but in his mind still thinks he's that 17, 18-year-old football player. That's Europe. They still think that there's this military power that dominated the 19th century, and they're not. They're a hollowed out shell of a continent where the military power has been, is really inconsequential. They're in the, if you're going to take them to a dog show, they're in the Chihuahua class, and yet they're wanting to take on Germany, who's in the Rottweiler class. Sorry.
Russia.
Russia, not Germany. My mistake. But Russia's in, I was saying Rottweiler, Germany, but now Russia is the Rottweiler class. I mean, they're this big dog. Europe, a bunch of yappy little dogs that, they have no significant economic resources. They've lost their industrial edge. They're not doing anything that's on the leading edge of science and technology. They're not leading in space. I mean, there's not a single sector you can point to where Europe, you go, yeah, the future could lie with them. They're living on a legacy.
Yeah. Now I've been trying to make sense of the European position as well, because I always make the point that I think that the Russians are fighting an existential war. The Ukrainians as well, I think, to a large extent, they're also this can also end Ukraine, so they also have a reason to fear an existential threat. So they both make sense. The Americans, they wanted to, they started this to knock out a key rival. It didn't work. They handed over to outsource it to the Europeans. Also makes sense, but the Europeans really don't make much sense. And one could try to engage people in this political leadership in discussions to dig out to find out what exactly is the logic here. What do you want to achieve? How do you intend to achieve it based on your resources? But if you look across all the countries in the EU, the politicians, the media, they only communicate in cliches, these emotional slogans. Anything that deviates from it is censored. I mean, there's a massive cost for anyone breaking with the narrative of the group. One gets the impression there's a mass psychosis forming, and if one would argue, well, if our territories are used to strike against Russia, wouldn't that push the Russians to retaliate, possibly, resulting in nuclear war? That's Putinist, because in any word of caution sounds like one wants to restrain the attacks on Russia, and that means you're with the Russians.
Yeah.
So, and no one can dissent. I mean, the idea that we have freedom of speech, dialogue, discussion, it's nonsense. There's none of the sort in Europe now. It's a loony bin, and there's no other objectives now than defeating Russia. All of this talk about, they put forward some plans about, opening diplomacy with Russia, but they set conditions, which essentially is for Russia to capitulate first. It's but beyond the hatred of Russia, though, do you think you hinted towards the inability or its lack of place in the world? It doesn't have the role it did in the past anymore. It doesn't really have a clear economic future. The partnership with the US is going away. Is this just desperation, you think, that, reflecting a wider problem